Blood slid down my lips and splattered onto the polished tile of the women's clinic, warm at first, then chilling as it spread. The lights overhead hummed softly, far too calm compared to the chaos unfolding. Above me loomed my stepbrother, Liam Harwood, fist tight, jaw locked, eyes burning with the kind of rage that always meant danger when we were kids. Other patients darted away, whispering, gasping, shielding children's eyes. "Pick how you're gonna pay or you're out for good." He barked, shoving a rolled stack of legal papers inches from my face. My vision doubled, the edges flickering. The surgical stitches still raw inside my abdomen screamed every time I tried to move. Like they were tearing apart all over again. A nurse pressed a trembling hand to her chest and hurried to call security, then 911. But Liam didn't care. He never had. My name is Dana Harwood. I'm 32. 2 weeks ago, I had a life full of hope. A baby on the way. A father who loved me more than anything. A home filled with memories. And now here I was bleeding. On the floor of a clinic while the man who should have been family tried to destroy. Every last piece of my world. It had all cracked. Open 3 days after my father's funeral, I'd just lost my baby 14 weeks along. A miscarriage that spiraled into a nightmare of hemorrhaging. Doctors shouting, lights blurring, a last-minute emergency procedure that saved my life. People said I was lucky. As if the word meant anything, I'd been staying at my father's house, the only place that felt safe enough to breathe. But safety didn't last long. Liam and my stepmother Victoria arrived without warning. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They showed up with a moving truck and entitlement in their footsteps. Liam let himself in with his key and strode through the door as if he'd grown up there. He hadn't. My father married Victoria when I was already an adult. Victoria trailed behind him wearing an expression of syrup-coated concern that never reached her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she crooned, stepping around boxes like she owned the air in the room. "We heard about the baby." Such a terrible sadness. But her gaze was already roaming over my father's antique cabinets. The art pieces he collected, the vintage clocks he restored on weekends, calculating. Always calculating. Liam wasted no time. He dropped a set of documents onto the kitchen island, the same spot where my father used to plate pancakes for me every Sunday morning, and tapped them sharply. "Sign these," he ordered. "Dad left everything to Mom and me. You get 10 grand today if you sign. Tomorrow it drops to 5. The absurdity nearly made me laugh. My father, who raised me alone from the time my mother died when I was 7, who ran Harwood Builders, with grit and generosity, would never disown me in favor of a stepson he barely tolerated. "That's impossible," I told him. "I want to see Dad's actual will." His face changed instantly. That familiar shade of purple climbed up his neck, a sign I'd learned long ago to brace myself for. "This is his will," he snapped, pushing the pages toward me again. He signed it 2 weeks before he passed. "You were too busy whining about your pregnancy to notice he was done with you." Pregnancy drama. That's what he called losing the child I prayed for, hoped for, waited years to conceive. I told him I needed time to think, to breathe, to consult an attorney. That was the first spark of his fury. "You've got 24 hours, he said, but the next day when I went to my follow-up appointment at the clinic, he was already waiting for me like a storm cloud. I didn't know how he found out, but later, I discovered the truth, the violation Victoria had been going through my phone while I slept. Liam stood up when I entered the waiting room, projecting his voice so everyone would hear. "Time's up. Sign now or get out of the house today." I didn't sign, and that's when his hand cracked across my face so hard my world shattered. I fell, tasting metal, ribs flaring with pain, the air punched from my lungs. He stood above me, sneering. "Think you're too good for 10 grand? Fine, now you get nothing." Sirens wailed outside seconds later. People were pointing. One woman cried. Security moved between us. Police stormed in. They arrested Liam on the spot, though Victoria posted his bail before I even had time to ice my face. My friend, Maggie, picked me up from the hospital afterward because I couldn't trust myself behind the wheel. When we reached the house, the locks had been changed. My belongings, everything I owned, were scattered across the front lawn like garbage waiting for collection. The sprinklers had soaked my clothes and books. Photo albums curled at the edges. Ruined, but nothing hurt more than the jewelry box my mother's last gift from my father smashed open on the concrete. Her pearls lay scattered across the driveway like tiny white tears. Maggie helped me gather what we could. She was 73, retired from a lifetime of forensic accounting. Sharp as a blade and loyal to a fault. She'd been my father's friend long before she was mine. "This isn't right," she kept muttering, lifting soggy photographs from the grass. "Your daddy would never have done this, never." She was right. My father had always told me his plan. The business profits would continue supporting the employees' retirement fund, and the rest would be divided fairly. Liam and Victoria were supposed to get the Florida house and a modest inheritance, fair, reasonable, balanced. But Liam never cared for fair. As he loaded my belongings into Maggie's old Buick. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patton, shuffled toward us, wringing her hands. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she whispered, looking toward the house nervously. "But your father, he seemed frightened the week before he passed. He asked to use my phone. Said he didn't trust his own. Thought someone was listening." Her words stuck with me long after Maggie tucked me into her guest room with tea, blankets, and painkillers. That night, the sound of breaking glass jolted me awake. Someone was trying to enter Maggie's house. We locked ourselves in our bedroom, armed with her late husband's baseball bat while we waited for a police stop. By the time officers arrived, whoever it was had disappeared, but not without leaving a message, spray painted across Maggie's garage. "Stop digging, or next time we come inside." When Liam showed up the next morning, pretending to be concerned, Maggie met him with fire in her eyes. "I've known you since you were a teenager stealing cash from your mother's purse," she snapped. "Get off my porch before I show you the surprise I keep in my handbag." She wasn't bluffing. Liam backed away. After he left, Maggie pulled out her laptop. "Honey," she said, adjusting her glasses, "your daddy wasn't always great with passwords. Let's see what your stepbrother has been doing behind everyone's back." What we found felt like ice water pouring through my veins. 5 years of embezzlement. Fake invoices. Shell companies. Phantom employees. Almost $500,000 siphoned from the business, and worse, from the employees' pension fund. But that wasn't the darkest part. The timing of the withdrawals. The changes in my father's medication. His sudden symptoms no doctor could explain. Maggie spoke softly but firmly, her voice trembling just slightly. "Dana, someone was accelerating your father's decline." And that's when I remembered my father's final lucid words in the hospital. "Check the basement safe. Behind the water heater. Your mother's birth date. A code." A message he didn't have the strength to explain. We had to get inside the house. There was only one way. The old basement window my father never fixed. The same one I used as a rebellious teenager sneaking home after curfew. At 2 in the morning, Maggie and I dressed in black and crept through the backyard. She whispered, "Good thing this is still technically your house." As I slid the window open and dropped inside, the basement smelled like cedar sawdust and my father's aftershave instantly familiar. We navigated past boxes and tools until we reached the water heater. Behind it, hidden by a cleverly disguised panel, was a small safe. I entered my mother's birthday. The lock clicked. Inside was the truth, raw, damning, heartbreaking. My father's real will. A folder of meticulously organized evidence documenting Liam's financial crimes. And a handwritten letter addressed to me, "My dearest Dana." His handwriting shook. Mine did too as I held the paper. He suspected Liam, suspected Victoria. He'd documented everything. He'd feared for his life but was afraid to act too soon. He wrote that he trusted Maggie and an attorney named Gerard Monroe, the lawyer he'd relied on for 3 decades, and then the most chilling line, "I believe they're tampering with my medication." Behind me, Maggie gasped softly as she flipped through another folder. Newspaper clippings about Victoria's past marriages, 3 dead husbands, 3 suspicious natural deaths, and all of them wealthy. My father had been husband number 4. We photographed everything. Then went upstairs. Liam had forgotten to log off his computer. That mistake would cost him everything. Email after email revealed poison, disguised as care. Instructions to Victoria. Plans to sell the company for far less than its value. Messages about handling me if I didn't cooperate. In one sentence that haunted me. The old man won't last much longer. They say hatred can wear the mask of family and still reach into your chest. We went to Gerard Monroe's office the morning after the safe. He kept his law books behind glass that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. A space that somehow felt like the last honest thing left in the world. Gerard was small and quick-witted, with a jaw that had learned the shape of my father's problems long before I did. He didn't gasp when I handed him the will or the folder full of bank statements. He sat very still, the way someone does when they are arranging a complicated chess move in their head. "This is why your father came to me," he murmured, smoothing the paper with a fingertip. He thought someone was interfering. He wanted a trail, a failsafe. He trusted you to finish what he started. Relief and fury braided together inside me. Relief because the truth had a handwriting and a stamp. Fury because I'd almost been pushed out of my own life. Gerard made a call, crisp and efficient. He arranged an immediate meeting with Detective Riley. Riley walked into Gerard's office in that no-nonsense way some people have, when they step into a room ready to take inventory of the lies that live there. She had a badge that looked like it had been earned with effort, and an expression that told you she'd been tugged awake by injustice more times than she could count. She listened to everything: my father's letter, the spreadsheet of falsified invoices, the emails, and said only what mattered. "We'll need more than this," she said quietly. "But it's enough to get warrants. We'll test the medication, freeze accounts, and get a forensics team on those emails. You did the right thing coming to us." Maggie and Gerard and Riley became the makeshift battalion I didn't know I needed. Maggie traced the money until the threads of theft unraveled: payroll accounts routed through shell entities, payments signed with forged initials, transfers to accounts that led, eventually, to a bankroll of gambling debt and lavish purchases on Liam's part. Gerard dug into the supposed notary signatures and found a man who had a record for falsifying documents. Riley pulled strings to test the pills my father had been taking. The lab results echoed the fear that had been sitting in my gut. The concentration of digitalis was far beyond therapeutic levels. It wasn't a mistake. It was slow clinical murder, but raw evidence didn't always move people as much as it should. We needed a confession. Liam's arrogance was our only weapon. He loved the sound of his own voice, the rush of knowing he'd gotten away with something. He boasted to Tiffany like a boy with a secret. He strutted through the house like a man who'd already painted his name on the world. So we baited him. I called him. I played the part of the beaten, broken sister, quiet, desperate, more naive than I felt. I told him I'd been thinking that I might sign for the right price. I let him think he crushed me. I made my voice crack and smeared my sorrow across the line with all the practiced heartbreak I could muster. "Okay," he sighed, triumphant. "Meet me at Harwood Builders tomorrow morning. Bring whoever you want to witness it. My lawyer will be there. We'll make it legal." He sounded like he'd swallowed the sun. He was sure he'd finally silenced me. We set a trap. Gerard arranged for witnesses and legal coverage. Riley positioned officers disguised as company consultants and janitorial staff. Maggie sat 2 chairs behind me, scanning every file on her tablet like a hawk. She had a way of looking dangerous in a cardigan, an accountant who could make numbers confess their sins. I wore my father's old sweater, because it smelled like him and because I wanted strength braided to my skin. I strapped a wire to my bra and prayed for it not to fail. My stomach fluttered with nervousness, the old incision a tight, anxious knot beneath my ribs. It felt like a promise to my lost baby, like I was doing this for 2 heartbeats. Liam arrived with Tiffany trailing behind, lacquered and loud. He sat in my father's leather chair the way people sit in a throne showy, entitled, already claiming a space he'd never earned. His hands shook just a little when he signed the first document. Maybe he was nervous because the stakes were rising and not because the paper had power. He thought legality was a veneer he could purchase. He had brought Vincent, the kind of man who slicks his hair back and smiles like he believes impression counts more than truth. Vincent's breathing sounded too loud for the room. He looked like someone who'd made a career out of pretending to be honest. We began to sign. I did something small and deliberate. I said the wrong thing at the precise moment it would sting. So once I signed, I asked, keeping the tremor in my voice practiced, "What happens to the pension fund?" Liam's smirk dropped like a curtain. "It's not your concern anymore. he said, the tone sliding into the familiar sneer I'd heard for years. You don't understand business. He answered exactly as a man who had been stealing for years would answer. He'd been planning to sell the company at a sliver of its true value so he could move the money before anyone noticed. That admission, casual and cold, was the crack we needed. At that point, Riley stepped forward. Her voice was calm but hard. William Henderson, she announced as plain as a verdict, we have probable cause for embezzlement and fraud. You are under arrest. Liam tried to run. He shoved past people, a wild animal who'd been caged by his own stupidity. An agent tackled him into a pot of ficus, dirt and leaves flying like accusation. Tiffany screamed and slapped at officers as if that would change what was happening. Vincent clambered toward a window and got tangled in curtains. Like a man caught in his own lies, Veronica Victoria wasn't the type to flee. She moved like a poisonous snake who believed cold blood bought her immunity. She reached for her phone, fingers on the screen, trying to delete messages or call someone who, I don't know. Maggie lunged, not with fists but with fury in a purse, and knocked the phone into the carpet. Veronica's taste for theatrics collided with the weight of her past. She'd assumed she could walk through life like a plotline and never be questioned. In the weeks that followed, the news cycle picked up like a summer storm. The relentless cameras were a different kind of courtroom, one with no gavel. Workers from Harwood Builders gathered to tell their stories. Men and women who had been given apprenticeships, paid medical bills. College tuition people my father had quietly saved from hard edges came forward and thanked him, the man they trusted like family. They could hardly believe the person who plotted to strip their pensions was a man who'd been raised under that very roof. At the arraignment, Gerard laid out the evidence like a map that could only lead one way. Wire transfers, forged signatures, emails with instructions to increase pill dosage, bank records that matched the lifestyle Liam had tried to buy, luxury watches and plane tickets bought on the backs of other people's futures. The medical tests that showed the lethal concentrations woven into my father's prescriptions sat like a crown of cold iron. Veronica's pattern of marriages was unearthed and displayed like a gallery of intent. The prosecutor showed timelines, medical records, and flight manifests. Old wives' tales of bad luck and coincidence crumbled under the sheer weight of documentation. She picked men with fragile hearts and families to make their ailments worse. The trial that followed was like standing at the edge of a cliff while someone rewound everything that had happened to build a clearer picture of what we'd all lived through. Witnesses came forward, former spouses, doctors, pharmacists, pieces falling into place in a horrifying mosaic. Tiffany, who had once posed like a queen in my father's office and whispered promises of yachts, took the stand and babbled about dreams of money, confirming that Liam had promised them riches. Her casual testimony was like salt in old wounds, naive and damaging. There were nights I slept poorly and days I woke with the taste of wood varnish in my mouth, the old sense that used to mean comfort. There were also small vindicating triumphs, people whose retirements had been saved by the freeze orders Gerard had secured. Employees who could breathe easier knowing their futures were protected. In court, the prosecutor told the story plainly. Liam had hollowed out the company for years. When my father began to suspect, he accelerated the plan. Veronica had been a pattern, a honeyed voice with a ledger of husbands and a talent for timing. Together, they created a narrative to inherit on the backs of others. The jury took 43 minutes. Or tie 3 minutes to decide the lives of men who'd thought the law was something they could rewrite in ink, guilty on all counts. Sentences were handed down like bolts anchored in stone. Life for the murder charge, decades for the fraud, time for the forgery. Vincent, the notary, squealed a deal and got a shorter sentence in exchange for names and dates. Tiffany sobbed one day in the witness room and later announced from a distance she was going to write a book about it all, demonstrating the odd human capacity to turn atrocity into spectacle. When I stood outside the courthouse afterward, the wind felt like permission. People I barely knew touched my shoulder. Gerard hugged me like a proud, exasperated uncle. Maggie laughed, a short, delighted sound that split the afternoon like light. Old ladies know everything, she said, and she meant it like a proclamation. There were settlements and restitutions. The company, under new trustees and honest management, regained stability. The pensions were restored with interest. People who'd feared losing retirement funds got their second chances. Harwood builders even found interest from investors who respected my father's legacy. And what had nearly been sold for pennies turned into a business with a healthy future. There were personal recoveries, two beyond the courtroom victories. Gerard returned a small envelope to me after the worst had subsided. Inside, my father had left a second safety deposit, old bonds, a letter to future grandchildren, and a note about seeds to plant in a garden he'd always loved. The bonds were enough to make the anger loosen its hold on my chest. They were also proof that my father had never stopped thinking ahead. Even when he feared he was trapped in love, stubborn and tender. Found its way back into my life. Dr. Noah Brooks, my emergency physician, the night my life tilta had watched their testimony and stood by me in the quieter moments when I needed a steady hand. He was a man whose hands had saved me once and whose patience held me twice. Coffee turned into conversation, and conversation into late-night dinners where the light felt safe. Noah did not rush me. He did not press me to fill the spaces left by grief. He showed up to the smallest victory and stayed through the long stretches of paperwork and phone calls, the things justice required beyond the drama of courtrooms. When I said I was scared to try again, fearful that grief had become a thief, he listened and said, "We'll go at your pace. Or not at all. I'll be here either way." We married quietly in the registrar's office, no pomp, no cameras, just two witnesses, Gerard's steady smile, and Maggie's delighted cackle. It felt honest, like the best possible answer you can give to a life that tried to break you. There were letters in the mail. One was from Liam, months into his sentence, asking for mercy, blaming circumstances, and Veronica. I sent it back without reading his words. There are some conversations you don't need to have with monsters. Time does not erase scar tissue. It simply teaches you how to move again with muscles that remember where to protect and where to reach. I went back to the company at first small, then gradually less afraid. The construction contracts my father had wanted, schools, a community center, the Riverwalk repairs began to resurface. We even won a bid to build a children's wing on the new hospital that had saved me. It felt like a circle closing in a just way. Maggie, once retired, became something like an honorary director for the company's audits. She liked the title even if no one else took her seriously as much as they should have. She accepted a forensic accounting award at a conference and wore a t-shirt under her blazer that said, "Never underestimate an old accountant." The room laughed and stood to applaud. She took a bow like a queen who'd been crowned by justice elf. Detective Riley used the publicity to start a task force that focused on elder exploitation cases of inheritance theft, caregiver abuse, medical manipulation. She told me once over lunch, if something good came out of Douglas Harwood's life, it's that people will be safer now. She didn't tell me about the night she couldn't sleep over some cases. Courage is an uncomfortable suit until it fits. Life did not return to what it had been. It returned to something that resembled a careful new architecture, walls built with intention, windows that opened to light with locks that worked, floors that held laughter. Noah and I planted a tree in my father's honor outside the office. The kind of maple that would one day be large enough for children to climb. It was a promise to the future. The pregnancy that followed crept into my life with gentle footsteps. It felt like a secret kept between my body and the soil of the garden my father had once tilled. When I stood at his gravesite months later, I laid a beer and a scrap of lemon cake on the stone because that's what he loved, small pleasures, stubborn and honest. I told him how we'd fought, how the company had been saved, how the pensioners could breathe again. "I think you'd be proud," I said, fingers cold on the granite. The wind turned its page in the trees, a sound like a page of a well-read book. For a single soft moment, it smelled like his cologne, fresh and familiar. I told him I was pregnant, and I laughed because the news felt impossible and holy. I told him about Noah. I told him that we'd be careful this time in different ways, with medicine, with paperwork, with trust. Maggie taught me to read financial statements. She delighted in translating the language of ledgers into a kind of plain truth. "You've got a good head," she'd said, flipping a ledger with the casual intimacy of someone who loved reading human truths in ink and numbers. "Your dad taught you to look at things long enough to see what they really are." Sometimes, at night, when sleep offered itself like a fragile thing to catch, I would touch my belly and think of the child I'd lost and the one who'd found its way back. My grief was a shape that never fully left me, but it no longer dominated the rooms in my house. There were laughter and dishwashing and small, steady comforts. The past existed like an outline you sometimes trace with your finger, not to reopen the wound, but to remember the map that led you through it. There were days when I still looked at the front lawn and expected boxes scattered like garbage. There were moments when I felt the old fear flare when a phone rang late, when someone used the wrong tone. But those were minutes, not lives. I learned to let the minutes go. Veronica was tried in a separate court. The evidence against her carefully compiled, full of annotated notes about medical regimens and transitions and prescriptions, painted a picture no jury could deny. She had a cold, patient intelligence about her crimes, a way of moving through people like a spider in its web. The sentence she received ensured she would never walk free again. When the verdicts were final and the sentences read and the last bangs of courtroom gavels faded, I made a list of what justice had returned to us: pensions saved, a company steady, a family name uncorrupted by thieves. It wasn't everything. The hole left by what I lost couldn't be stuffed by restitution or verdicts. But it mattered more than money or retribution to see the men and women who'd trusted my father get their futures back. Months later, standing at the groundbreaking for the children's Winghard hat, a little too big on my head, I felt something like peace settle in my bones. Tom, the foreman who'd been my father's oldest friend, stood beside me and squeezed my hand until we both laughed at the necessary stiffness of official photographs. After we lowered the ceremonial shovel, Noah kissed me like someone who had found a harbor. Babies are a kind of bridge, I thought, a narrow way between what we have experienced and what we will teach them. I placed my hand over my belly in public and felt the small, miraculous thrum like the echo of life's first drumbeat. People asked me how I survived. If I bore bitterness, if I sought revenge beyond what the law had delivered. I had to think carefully before answering. Survival, I learned, wasn't a single act of endurance. It was a series of small decisions, holding on to truth, refusing to be silenced. Trusting the few people who choose you despite the world's noise. When the baby came tiny, fierce and pink, there were so many hands to hold. Maggie cried and made a face that said the world could be expected to heal. Gerard left a card that said, simply, for the next generation. Detective Riley sent a tiny knitted hat she'd made in between cases. Tom named the child's first toy truck. Noah stood by the bassinet like a sentinel of gentle things. I sometimes think about my father's last days. I replay his handwriting, the way he tried to warn me without making me a target. I think about the night the safe clicked open and the breathless certainty I felt walking out of the basement with the truth in my hands. That moment is carved into me, the moment I decided to follow the path even when the ground was treacherous. There is a quiet joy now, a rhythm of ordinary days that feels earned. I teach the little ones at the company's safety day how to put on helmets properly. I plant more trees. I sign documents with Gerard's careful oversight, because some lessons you have to relearn with vigilance. I still keep the emergency numbers and a note tucked behind the photos by my bedside. Because some people don't change. Sometimes, when evening settles and the light goes the color of old honey through the kitchen windows, Noah and I sit at the island and listen to our child breathe. I tell him stories of a man who built more than houses, who built a community, of a woman who never truly loved, of a stepson who chose greed over blood. We tell the child about truth and how fierce it can be when it refuses to be buried. And in the quiet, I let the long, slow years teach me how to be gentle with myself. There are no easy endings to lives tangled with betrayal. There are, however, new beginnings, the kind you build deliberately, brick by careful brick. My father's hat hangs on a peg. I wear it sometimes when I'm nervous, when the old ache of loss presses at my ribs. It feels like guidance, like a hand drawn across my shoulder. The past is a map now, not a chain. I walk forward with it in my pocket, a heavy, precious thing. The blueprint of what I've survived and what I must protect. The world taught me harsh lessons, but some people can practice cruelty with a smile. That institutions require vigilant guardians. And that grief makes you a craftsman of survival. But it also taught me that love, quiet, stubborn, earnest, can rebuild what's been smashed. When I tell this story, I speak softly for those who are too afraid to speak. I tell it so that what happened to my father, to his employees, to the child I lost, to the quiet women who fear they'll be the next target, that it will not be forgotten. I tell it because truth deserves a voice, and sometimes truth needs help to be heard. If you ever find yourself wondering whether you can stand up when they tell you to sit down, remember the basement safe and the letter with my father's shaky handwriting. Do not let fear decide for you. There are people who will stand in the light with you, even when the night surrounds you. When I hold my child, whose small hands curl around my finger like another promise, I tell him stories of honesty and courage, of men who build and women who protect, of a community that refused to be undone. I tell him about the maple tree we planted that will one day give shade to little ones running in the yard. And I teach him to read contracts even if he's only 6. In the end, justice was not a single thunderclap. It was the slow, steady work of people who refused to look away. Lawyers, detectives, a retired accountant with a sharp tongue and an iron heart, neighbors willing to speak, friends who would not be silenced. The melody of ordinary days returned, but with a richer, harder harmony. I learned to trust again in small increments and to demand truth in the documents I signed and in the hands I chose to hold. The house that had once been the scene of betrayal became a place where lunch was warm and laughter landed like birds. There is no neat, tidy ending to sorrow, no final page you can close and walk away from unmarked. But there is an unfolding, a continued story that we write with small, honest choices, daily bravery, and the stubborn kindness of people who refuse to let evil win.